Welcome back to the deep dive. So today, we're going way back, like way back to ancient India. I think 600 to 300 BCE.
Whoa, that's old.
It is. And you know how we always hear about those massive empires in India, like the Mauryas and the Guptas.
Yeah. The big ones, right?
Exactly. Well, before them, there were the Mahajanapadas, kind of like the OG power players. They were there first.
It's like a whole different chapter of history, right?
Right.
Like a prequel we don't always hear about.
Totally. It was a time of like mega transformation. Just imagine a whole society shifting from, small nomadic tribes to these powerful kingdoms.
Yeah, that's a huge leap. Like watching the birth of a civilization, but on fast forward.
Right. So, okay, Mahajanapadas, the name itself kind of sounds epic, like great realm.
Mhm.
But what were they really like? Like what made them tick?
So think of it this way. Before this period, you've got smaller groups just moving around, living off the land.
Right. Basic survival mode.
Exactly. But things change. Agriculture takes root, people settle down, populations grow, and boom, suddenly you need a whole new level of organization. And that's where the Mahajanapadas come in.
So it's not just about like more food and bigger farms, right?
Yeah.
It's about figuring out like how to run a whole kingdom.
Exactly. You need taxes, laws, systems for managing resources, resolving disputes. Remember, you're going from tribal councils to kings with advisors, courts, whole bureaucracy.
Whoa, so you're saying like all our complaints today about bureaucracy,
Right.
the roots go all the way back to the Mahajanapadas.
Plus, in a way, yeah, they were pioneers, laying the groundwork for how states would function for like centuries.
Wow. Okay, so we've got kingdoms popping up, figuring out how to govern. And get this, at the same time, the Vedas, those ancient Hindu texts, were being composed.
No way. Talk about timing.
It can't be just coincidence, right?
Not at all. What's amazing is how those Vedic ideas like dharma and karma got woven into the fabric of these kingdoms, like their operating system.
Okay, dharma, karma.
Yeah.
These are biggies. For someone who's like totally new to these ideas, how would you explain them?
Okay, so dharma, it's kind of like a cosmic job description. It tells you what's expected of you based on your place in society. It's like a blueprint for a harmonious society.
So not just about being like a good person, but fulfilling a specific role.
Right. If you're a warrior, your dharma is to be brave. If you're a farmer, it's to provide food. Everyone playing their part.
Okay, makes sense. And karma.
Ah, karma. Think of it as like the cosmic scorecard. Every action has a consequence, not just now, but maybe even in future lives. So it encouraged people to act in accordance with dharma.
So like a built-in accountability system, ensuring people think twice before messing up.
Right. Now, were people always focused on their cosmic scorecard? Well, humans will be humans, right? But the idea of karma, it definitely had a powerful influence, a moral framework.
Right. Okay, so these Vedic ideas, they weren't just abstract concepts. They were literally baked into these kingdoms. And that had some, like, serious ripple effects for centuries to come.
Absolutely. It shaped the social hierarchy, emphasized fulfilling your duty, even the way kings justified their rule. It gave the whole system legitimacy.
So it wasn't just about brute force. There was this, like, moral and spiritual dimension to it all.
Exactly. And it shows how interconnected everything was. The political, social, religious, all woven together in this tapestry that defined life in the Mahajanapadas.
Okay, so these Mahajanapadas, they weren't just, like, a random blip in history. They left some serious footprints, right?
Definitely. They were like the architects of so much of what came later in India.
And they're not just, like, a single entity.
Well, no. There were several like key players. You've mentioned a few, Magadha, Kosala, Vatsa. Each one was unique.
Okay, so what made these Mahajanapadas stand out? Let's start with Magadha. What made them so special?
Well, Magadha, they kind of hit the jackpot, geographically speaking. They were right smack in the middle of those fertile Gangetic plains, abundant resources.
Okay, so prime real estate. Fertile land equals more food, more people, more resources.
Exactly. And get this, they also had access to iron ore deposits.
Ah, so they had the military edge. Iron swords versus what, bronze. That's a game changer.
Huge advantage. And they also had some like seriously ambitious rulers. They weren't afraid to flex their muscles.
So it was like the perfect recipe for success, location, resources, and strong leadership.
Precisely.
Okay, so what about Kosala? What was their story?
Kosala was also in the Gangetic Plains, but further west. They were known for their like super strong agricultural base, a solid foundation.
Okay, so similar to Magadha in that way. But what set them apart?
Think of Kosala as like the master planners. They were all about efficient administration, a well-oiled bureaucracy, a strong legal system.
So they have more brains than brawn.
Well, they had a powerful military too, but yeah, their focus on order and stability that really made them successful.
Okay, that makes sense. So we got Magadha with its resources and ambition, Kosala with its planning and stability.
Yeah.
What about Vatsa? Where do they fit in?
Vatsa was a bit smaller. They were located on the banks of the Yamuna River, known for their trade networks, skilled artisans, and bustling urban centers.
Ah, so they were like the merchant kings.
Yeah, you could say that. They controlled important trade routes, renowned for their craftsmanship, especially textiles and metalwork. If you wanted luxury goods, Vatsa was the place to be.
Okay, so each Mahajanapada had its own strengths, its own path to power.
Exactly. And the competition between them, the alliances and rivalries, it all shaped the political landscape of ancient India.
Right, right. But before we get into all that political drama, let's zoom in on, like, everyday life. What was it actually like to live in these kingdoms?
Ah, good point. We've talked about kings and conquests, but what about the farmers, the artisans, the families? How did their lives change with this shift from tribal life to a more structured society?
Yeah, like how did this shift impact like their daily routines, their beliefs, their sense of who they were?
Well, to answer that, we need to dig into the social structures of the Mahajanapadas, especially the caste system. We've mentioned it briefly, but there's a lot more to unpack.
Right. And that brings us back to like the Vedic influence, doesn't it? Dharma and karma, they weren't just abstract ideas. They had a real impact on how people lived.
Oh, absolutely. Dharma, especially, provided this framework for social order, defining the duties and responsibilities of each person based on their caste and stage of life.
So it's not just about, being a good person in a general sense. There were specific expectations tied to your position.
Precisely. And these expectations were like ingrained in the culture, reinforced by religious beliefs. It was almost like being part of a giant play. Everyone has their role, their lines, their cues.
Whoa, that's a cool way to think about it. So everyone knew their place, their part in the grand scheme of things. What about karma? How did that, like, play out in everyday life?
Imagine a video game where every choice, every action has consequences, right?
Yeah, I'm with you.
That's karma. It encouraged people to make choices that aligned with their dharma, knowing those choices would shape their future, not just in this life, but maybe in future lives too.
So it wasn't about avoiding punishment in this life, but about understanding the long-term consequences, like building good karma for the future. But did it also create, like, a sense of fatalism? If everything's predetermined by karma, what's the point of trying to change anything?
Ah, great question. And one that was definitely debated. But remember, karma wasn't just fate. It was about understanding that your actions have consequences. So even though your past actions might have shaped your present circumstances, you still have the power to choose your actions now, and those choices would then shape your future.
So it's about agency, but within this context of karma.
Exactly. It was a nuanced way of understanding the relationship between free will and consequence.
Okay, so getting back to the everyday experience of people in these kingdoms, how did dharma and karma actually play out in their lives?
Well, take dharma, for example. It wasn't just some abstract concept. It was a practical guide for living. The Vedas outlined specific duties and responsibilities for individuals based on their social position and stage of life.
So dharma had like specific guidelines and expectations.
Exactly. For example, a young student's dharma was to focus on learning. A householder's dharma was to care for their family. It provided structure.
A very structured way of life then, everyone with their role to play. What about karma? How did that concept influence people's choices?
Well, the idea of karma encouraged people to act in accordance with dharma, knowing that their actions had consequences. It fostered a sense of accountability and responsibility, not just to society, but also to themselves.
So it wasn't a divine being, like judging your actions. It was more about understanding the natural consequences of your choices.
Right. The Vedas emphasize that we weave our own destiny through our actions.
Wow, so dharma and karma, they weren't just philosophical ideas. They were the bedrock of society, shaping everything from social roles to individual choices.
Absolutely. They were integral to life in the Mahajanapadas.
Okay, so it seems like a pretty well-ordered system, at least in theory. But was everyone happy with their place in the hierarchy? Was there any room for, like, social mobility?
Well, that's where things get a bit, messy. The ideal was this harmonious society, right? But reality was more complicated.
Of course. Human societies are rarely that tidy. So where do we see those cracks in the ideal?
Well, for example, you start to see new professions and economic activities that don't neatly fit into the existing caste system. Remember, the Vedas were written during a period of transition, and the social structure had to adapt.
So as these kingdoms grew and diversified, new opportunities emerged that challenged the traditional order.
Exactly. For example, the rise of merchants and traders, they accumulated wealth and influence, but their position within the caste system wasn't always clear-cut.
Ah, so you have this tension between the old order and the new realities.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Exactly. And this tension played out in different ways through social reforms, political maneuvering, even reinterpretations of religious texts. It was a society grappling with change.
Okay, I can see that. So speaking of change, I'm curious about the nitty-gritty of daily life. What did people eat? What did they wear? What were their homes like? What did they do for fun?
Great questions. And we do have glimpses into these aspects of their lives, thankfully.
Okay, tell me everything. What's the ancient Indian scoop?
Uh-huh. All right. Well, agriculture was like the backbone, right? So grains like rice, wheat, barley, lots of carbs.
Makes sense. Fuel for the people.
Right. And of course, lentils, veggies, fruits were also important.
What about protein? Meat?
It depended on their caste and beliefs. Some did, some didn't. But cattle were highly valued for milk and as work animals, so beef was generally avoided. We see the beginnings of the sacred cow concept.
Oh, interesting. Okay, food. Check. What about clothes?
Cotton was the main fabric. They were fantastic weavers, producing a variety of textiles. Imagine breezy cotton tunics for everyday use, maybe some silk for special occasions.
So, like a hierarchy of fashion even back then.
You could say that. They used wool and silk, but those were more expensive and associated with higher status.
Okay, fashion, check. Now, housing. Where did people live?
Most people lived in villages, in homes made of mud brick or wood. Simple but functional. The size and style, of course, varied depending on their social standing.
So simpler homes for farmers, more elaborate ones for the wealthy merchants and landowners.
Exactly. And in the cities, you'd find more substantial buildings, palaces, temples, bustling marketplaces.
Wow, it's fascinating to imagine these ancient cities. What about entertainment? What did people do for fun?
Storytelling, music, and dance were huge. And religious festivals, they were big social gatherings, celebrations, community bonding.
Okay, so a mix of traditional entertainment and religious festivities. What about games? Any sports or board games?
Oh, yeah. Dice games were popular, and there's evidence of early forms of chess and other board games.
Hmm.
Picture this, sitting around a fire, rolling dice, strategizing.
Sounds fun.
And for the upper classes, hunting was a common pastime.
Okay, so we're building a picture here. Food, fashion, homes, entertainment. It sounds like we're starting to get a pretty good idea of daily life in the Mahajanapadas. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the Vedic influence, but I'm curious about their religious practices specifically. Did they all follow the same beliefs? Were there different schools of thought?
Well, the Vedic tradition was dominant, yes. But it wasn't like everyone believed the exact same thing, you know? There were variations between kingdoms. And even within each kingdom, different schools of thought existed.
So like a spiritual buffet, with people picking and choosing the elements that resonated with them.
Haha, yeah, kind of like that. And keep in mind, this was a time of, religious ferment. New ideas were challenging the existing order.
Oh, so it wasn't all just following the Vedas. What other beliefs were popping up?
This is when we see the rise of Jainism and Buddhism, both pretty radical for their time. They challenged the authority of the Vedas and offered alternative paths to spiritual liberation.
Wow, so those seeds of religious diversity that would come to define India were already there.
Exactly. And the Mahajanapadas, they actually played a key role in nurturing this diversity.
So these kingdoms weren't just about territorial expansion and economic growth. They were also hubs of religious innovation and debate.
Absolutely. It was a vibrant time, religiously and intellectually.
Okay, I'm getting a sense of that. So what did religious life in the Mahajanapadas look like? What were their rituals and ceremonies like?
Rituals and sacrifices were a big part of Vedic practice. They believed that by performing these rituals correctly, they could please the gods and ensure the well-being of the kingdom.
So like a cosmic insurance policy.
Haha, you could put it that way. But it was more than that. They were also seen as a way to connect with the divine, to show gratitude. The rituals themselves were elaborate, involving chanting, offerings, specific procedures.
Okay, so rituals were a big deal. What else?
Temples were also central as places of worship and pilgrimage. People would go to offer prayers, make offerings, and participate in festivals. They were the social and spiritual hubs of their communities.
Okay, temples, check. What about the role of priests?
Priests were essential. They were the intermediaries between people and the gods, the keepers of knowledge, the conductors of rituals, interpreters of the divine will.
So like spiritual advisors and interpreters of the divine. Makes sense. Now, what about the average person? Did everyone participate in these like elaborate rituals?
Well, not everyone had the means to participate in the grandest rituals, but religious beliefs, they permeated their daily lives.
So religion wasn't just something you did on like special occasions. It was a part of everyday life.
Exactly. People would offer prayers at home, perform simple rituals, seek blessings for their daily activities.
So a more personal and integrated approach to spirituality.
Exactly. It provided comfort, guidance, and a sense of community in a world that could often feel, well, unpredictable.
Right, right. Okay, so we've got this like rich tapestry of religious beliefs and practices, new spiritual traditions emerging, and this deep integration of religion into everyday life. But how did all of this play out in the like political sphere? Did religion influence the decisions of kings and how they governed?
That's a fascinating question, and it highlights that complex relationship between religion and politics even back then.
Right, because on the one hand, we have this emphasis on dharma as the guiding principle for like righteous rulership.
Exactly. Kings were expected to rule in accordance with dharma to uphold justice and order and to protect their people. Their right to rule, their legitimacy, was often tied to their piety and their adherence to religious principles.
So dharma as a kind of like divine mandate for kings. But, did they always live up to these ideals?
Well, power can be corrupting, right? And there were definitely cases where kings prioritized their own ambitions over dharma.
So even with this ideal of righteous rulership, they weren't always saints.
Not always. There are plenty of stories of kings who, let's say, manipulated religious justifications for their actions. It's that tension between the ideal and the reality of power, a tale as old as time.
So you have this fascinating mix, this religious ideal shaping political power, but also political pragmatism, bending those ideals to fit their own needs.
Exactly. And this dynamic, it's a theme that runs throughout history.
Okay, so we've got this interplay between dharma and power.
Mm.
What of the role of priests? Did they have any political influence?
Oh, absolutely. Priests weren't just spiritual advisors. They held positions of authority in the royal courts. They could influence the king's decisions, interpret religious laws, even legitimize the king's rule through blessings and rituals.
So they were like the ancient world's political consultants, whispering in the king's ear.
Haha, yeah, something like that. And don't forget about the temples. They were centers of worship, yes, but also economic powerhouses. They controlled land, wealth, resources.
So like wielding both spiritual and material influence, a bit like those powerful monasteries in medieval Europe.
Exactly, and that gave them leverage. Kings often sought their support, granting them land and privileges in exchange for blessings and the loyalty of their followers.
So a delicate dance of power between the secular and the sacred.
You got it. It played a big role in shaping the political landscape of the Mahajanapadas.
Okay, so we have dharma, priests, temples, all influencing the political scene. What about the impact of those new religious movements, Jainism and Buddhism? Did they challenge the existing order?
Well, both offered critiques of the traditional hierarchy and emphasized individual spiritual liberation. They challenged the authority of rituals and social norms, which was a shakeup to the status quo.
Right, because questioning the caste system inevitably means questioning the entire political order.
Exactly, which is why some kings resisted these movements. But eventually, both gained wider acceptance and even royal patronage.
So another example of that tension between tradition and change
Right.
playing out on the religious and political stage.
Precisely. And the Mahajanapadas were right at the center of it, fostering both religious diversity and the Vedic traditions. It's a fascinating mix.
Okay, so we've covered like the political landscape,
Yeah.
the social structure, everyday life, and the influence of religion. I think we're starting to get a pretty good grasp of the Mahajanapadas.
I agree. It's a fascinating and complex period of Indian history, a time of innovation, change, and the beginnings of a major civilization.
Absolutely. But, we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore.
Oh, for sure. We haven't even touched on their art, architecture, literature.
Right. Or their military strategies, the specific innovations they developed in governance, all those details that bring this period to life.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dig into next. We'll uncover those layers, those hidden gems that reveal the true brilliance of the Mahajanapadas.
I'm ready. Let's get to it.
And their innovations in governance. It's mind-boggling how much they achieved.
Right. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground: politics, religion, everyday life. But there's like a whole other dimension we haven't touched yet, right? Their creativity.
Ah, yes. The Mahajanapadas weren't just about power and politics. They were bursting with artistic talent, incredible architecture, and fascinating literature.
Okay, let's talk art. What kind of art did they create? What were their sculptures and paintings like? What about
Oh.
their architecture?
Just imagine you're walking through a bustling city in a Mahajanapada. Everywhere you look, there's art. Intricate carvings on temples, delicate metalwork in the marketplace, vibrant murals telling stories on every wall.
Wow. So like a really diverse artistic landscape.
Oh, absolutely. And much of it reflects their religious beliefs and mythology. Depictions of gods and goddesses, scenes from epic tales, symbols representing spiritual concepts.
So they were using art to connect with the divine, to make those unseen worlds visible.
Exactly, but it wasn't all about religion. They also depicted scenes from everyday life, their customs, relationships, even their political hopes and dreams.
So they were capturing those little moments that make a culture unique, those human experiences that connect us across time. Do you have any like specific examples that really capture that spirit?
Oh, tons. But one that always comes to mind is the lion capital of Ashoka. It's a magnificent sculpture, actually, from the Mauryan period, but it draws heavily from the artistic heritage of the
Ah,
Mahajanapadas.
yes, I've seen pictures of that. It's got those four lions standing back to back. It's so powerful. It's like a national symbol of India now, right?
It is, and it speaks volumes about the artistic skill and the vision of those who came before. They really set the stage for amazing artistic achievements.
It's incredible. Okay, sculptures, check. What about paintings? Any notable examples there?
Oh, have you ever heard of the Ajanta caves?
Um, Vaguely. Remind me.
They're a series of rock-cut caves in western India dating back to the 2nd century BCE, and they're filled with these exquisite murals. It's like stepping back in time, seeing these vibrant colors, these expressive figures, and incredibly intricate details.
Wow, that sounds breathtaking. What kind of scenes do they depict?
Many of them show scenes from the life of the Buddha and also a lot of Jataka tales.
Jataka tales.
Yeah. They're stories about the Buddha's previous lives before he became the Buddha. He's born as different animals, learning these valuable lessons about compassion, wisdom, and the path to enlightenment.
Oh, right. Like ancient fables with a Buddhist twist.
Exactly. And the murals themselves are so sophisticated. They capture subtle emotions, intricate details of clothing, even the dynamism of movement. It's truly remarkable.
Amazing. Murals, check. Now, what about architecture? We touched on temples earlier, but what other architectural styles did they have?
Well, they built palaces, of course, for the rulers, but also, fortifications to protect their cities, stupas, those dome-shaped Buddhist shrines, and impressive public buildings.
So a wide range of architectural styles. What were some of their key features?
They primarily used wood, brick, and stone, but it's how they used them that's impressive. They adorned their buildings with carvings, sculptures, and all these decorative elements. And their mastery of columns, arches, and domes, they created structures that were both grand and inspiring.
So they weren't just building practical structures. They were making artistic statements with their architecture.
Absolutely. Their buildings reflect their cultural and spiritual values. And let's not forget the practical side, too. Like building a stupa, it wasn't just about beauty, but creating a sacred space for meditation and contemplation.
Okay, so art and architecture, check. What about literature? What kind of literary works did they produce?
Oh, this was the time when the great Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, were really taking shape.
Oh, wow. Those epic tales of gods and heroes and epic battles. I remember reading parts of them in school. They're like foundational texts for Indian culture, right?
They are. And they're not just entertaining stories, although they're definitely that. They're packed with philosophical insights, moral lessons, and explorations of human nature. The really big questions: good and evil, duty and desire, fate and free will.
So kind of like the ancient Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Exactly. These stories capture the essence of a culture, its values and beliefs. They were passed down orally for generations, and they still inspire people today.
Amazing. So Epics? Check. What about other types of literature? Did they have poetry, plays, things like that?
Oh, definitely. They weren't just about epic narratives. They explored a whole range of human emotions, the beauty of nature, even the mysteries of the cosmos through poetry, devotional hymns, and even early forms of drama.
So pretty vibrant literary scene then. And didn't we mention earlier that the Upanishads, those philosophical
Uh-huh.
texts, were also taking shape around this time?
Yes, that's right. They were delving into the nature of reality and the self, adding another layer to this rich literary tradition.
Wow, so they were really exploring all these different avenues of expression.
They were, and their literature gives us a glimpse into their minds, their beliefs, their values, how they saw the world. It's a treasure trove of insights.
Okay, we've got art, architecture, literature.
Yeah.
What about music and dance? I know we talked about them as entertainment, but were they also considered art forms?
Absolutely. Music and dance were woven into the fabric of their culture. They were part of religious ceremonies, court entertainment, celebrations, and even everyday life.
So what kind of music did they make? What instruments did they play?
Imagine a festival in a Mahajanapada. You'd hear drums beating, flutes playing melodic tunes, the twang of stringed instruments like the veena, and the clash of cymbals. Their music was full of life, emotion, and a deep connection to their heritage.
Sounds pretty awesome. And what about their dances?
They had so many different styles and techniques, varying from region to region, but their dances weren't just about movement. They told stories, expressed emotions, and even conveyed spiritual ideas.
So it's like storytelling, emotional expression, and spiritual practice all in one.
Exactly. And many of these dance forms were passed down through generations. They were a living embodiment of their history and culture.
Wow. Okay, so we've got art, architecture, literature, music, and dance. It sounds like the Mahajanapadas were incredibly culturally advanced.
They were. And their cultural achievements didn't just disappear, they had a lasting impact. They laid the foundation for the rich and diverse cultural heritage of India that we see today.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've explored so much politics, social structure, daily life, religion, and now their amazing cultural achievements. I think we're getting a really comprehensive picture of the Mahajanapadas.
I agree. It's such a fascinating and complex period. It's amazing to see how much they accomplished and how much they influenced later periods in Indian history.
Right, but even with all we've covered, it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many more stories to tell, so many fascinating details to uncover.
For sure. But for now, it's time to move on to something else. It's really important for understanding the Mahajanapadas, their legacy. We know they influenced later empires, but what about their lasting impact on India as a whole? How did they shape the India we know today?
That's a fantastic question. And the legacy of the Mahajanapadas is, well, it's multifaceted and profound. They really laid the groundwork for a unified India, both politically and culturally.
Okay, let's break that down. How did they contribute to, like, the political unification of India?
Well, remember, before the Mahajanapadas, India was mainly smaller, independent tribes, right? Their emergence marked a shift towards larger, more centralized political entities. They were the ones who figured out how to create and manage these larger, more complex systems of government.
Right, it's like they created the blueprint for empires like the Mauryas, who would later unify much of the subcontinent.
Exactly. The Mahajanapadas were like the testing ground for the idea of a unified India. And their innovations in governance became the model for future rulers.
So they were the architects of empire building in India, setting the stage for a more unified and powerful nation.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. And their legacy isn't just about political unity, but also cultural unity. Think of them as like cultural ambassadors, spreading ideas and traditions across different regions through their patronage of art, literature, and religion.
So how did they contribute to that cultural unity?
Think about those epics we talked about, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They originated during this period, and they spread throughout India. They transcended regional differences and language barriers.
So shared stories creating a shared culture, even across a diverse population.
Exactly. And this cultural unity, fostered by the Mahajanapadas, would become a defining feature of Indian civilization going forward.
Okay, so political unification, cultural unity.
Hmm.
What about their impact on social structure? Did they also influence the India we know today in that area?
Absolutely. The social hierarchy, with its emphasis on caste and dharma, it really took root during the Mahajanapada period, and it continued to shape Indian society for centuries.
Right, we talked about the caste system, how it became more rigid over time. Well, that's not exactly a positive legacy.
True, the caste system, with its inherent inequalities, has caused social division and conflict. But the concept of dharma, with its emphasis on duty and righteous action, that has also provided a moral framework for generations. It's a complex legacy.
Yeah, a mixed bag, both positive and negative aspects. What about economically? Did they leave behind any lasting economic structure?
Oh, absolutely. They were pioneers in agriculture, trade, and commerce. They laid the foundation for India's economic growth and prosperity in the centuries that followed.
So not just conquerors and rulers, but also builders and innovators, creating a legacy that extended far beyond their own time.
That's right. And their story is a reminder that even in the ancient world, there were sophisticated societies capable of achieving great things.
Okay, so we've explored their rise, their achievements, their legacy, but we've talked about these Mahajanapadas as separate kingdoms. Did they ever interact with each other? Like, were there alliances or rivalries between them?
Oh, definitely. The Mahajanapadas were not isolated. They were constantly interacting, forming alliances, engaging in rivalries, and even waging war for dominance.
Okay, so it wasn't just about internal development. They were also shaping the political landscape of ancient India through their interactions.
Exactly. Imagine it like a giant chessboard. Each Mahajanapada making strategic moves, trying to outmaneuver the others and gain influence. Alliances made and broken, betrayals, wars. It was a high-stakes game.
So, like the Game of Thrones of ancient India.
Haha, that's a great way to put it. And just like in any good Game of Thrones story, there were winners and losers, heroes and villains, and stories passed down through the ages.
So tell me about some of those stories. What were some of the major alliances and rivalries?
One of the most famous was the rivalry between Magadha and Kosala. They were both vying for control of the fertile Gangetic plains. You remember, Magadha with its resources and ambitious rulers, and Kosala with its strong agriculture and efficient administration.
Yeah, we talked about them before, a clash of the titans.
It was. But there were also alliances. Smaller kingdoms would sometimes band together to counter a more powerful kingdom like Magadha. It was all about survival, protecting their interests.
Right, makes sense. A classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. And sometimes they'd join forces to repel invaders from outside India. It was a complex web of alliances, always shifting and changing based on the political landscape.
Okay, rivalries, alliances. What about wars? Any big showdowns that changed the course of history?
Oh, yes. One of the most significant was Magadha's conquest of Kosala, a brutal conflict that really shifted the balance of power in northern India.
Wow, a turning point. So what happened after that?
Well, Magadha gained control of a huge territory, becoming the dominant power in the region. This victory set the stage for their eventual rise to empire status, paving the way for the Mauryan Empire.
So a pretty major event. It sounds like the Mahajanapada period wasn't all just peaceful development.
You're right. It was also a time of ambition, conflict, and struggles for power. But even amidst all the conflicts, something remarkable was happening. The Mahajanapadas were, in their own way, laying the groundwork for something bigger.
I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
Well, even as they were fighting each other, they were also interacting and exchanging ideas. They traded goods, they shared cultural practices, they even influenced each other's political systems. And this sharing of ideas and cultures, this blending, eventually contributed to a more unified Indian civilization.
So their conflicts were, in a way, also paving the way for unity.
Exactly. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Out of conflict, unity. And that's what makes the Mahajanapada period so interesting. It's a story of ambition and power struggles, but also of innovation, creativity, and the birth of a civilization that would change the world.
It really is. Like, thinking about those kings, battling it out for control while also, like, accidentally creating a unified culture. It's pretty wild.
It is. It really highlights those unexpected turns in history, the unintended consequences. But it makes you wonder, right? Like, were the Mahajanapadas unique in this, or were other parts of the world experiencing similar transformations?
That's such a good question. Like, were they just doing their own thing, or were they part of a bigger picture? And, we've talked about the Vedic texts emerging during this time. Were there, like, other big ideas popping up in other parts of the world around the same time?
You're hitting on a really key point. From 600 to 300 BCE, all around the world, things were changing. It's a period historians call the Axial Age.
Okay, the Axial Age. That sounds like super important. Tell me more. What was going on?
Basically, it was a time when people were really questioning everything. Their societies, religion, the meaning of life. You see it everywhere, from ancient Greece to Persia to China. It's like humanity was having a collective aha moment.
Whoa, so like a global awakening.
Exactly. Think about ancient Greece. You have Socrates questioning everything, Plato and his theory of forms, Aristotle with his emphasis on logic. All these thinkers pushing the boundaries of knowledge and challenging traditional ways of thinking.
Wow, so the Mahajanapadas, with their political innovations, their social structures, those religious debates, they were part of this larger global trend.
They were. They weren't isolated. They were connected to a world that was going through this massive shift in consciousness,
Yeah.
how people saw themselves, their place in the universe. It's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. So besides ancient Greece, what other civilizations were part of this axial age thing?
Well, in Persia, you have Zoroaster introducing this idea of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, which would have a huge impact on religious thought.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. What about China? Were there any big thinkers there?
Oh, definitely. You've got Confucius promoting ethical behavior and social harmony, and Lao Tzu emphasizing living in harmony with nature. Their ideas still resonate today.
Wow, so basically all over the world, people were grappling with those fundamental questions about existence, morality, and reality itself.
Right. And each civilization developed its own unique answers, its own worldview. And those ideas, they spread through trade routes, travelers, diplomatic exchanges. It was like a global network of ideas.
It's amazing. So the Mahajanapadas were part of this global conversation, this shared human experience of seeking deeper meaning and understanding.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying history so exciting. You see these connections, these shared experiences that link us to people from long ago.
It's incredible. It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've explored the rise of the Mahajanapadas, their innovations, their cultural achievements, their connection to this axial age. I feel like we've really taken a deep dive.
We have, and honestly, we've only scratched the surface. There's still so much more to learn about these amazing kingdoms.
Right. Like, we could probably do a whole series on the Mahajanapadas. But for now, we've come to the end of our deep dive.
And what a journey it's been.
It really has. So to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this trip back in time. We hope you've enjoyed learning about the Mahajanapadas and this incredible chapter in Indian history. And remember, history isn't just about facts and dates. It's about people, their stories, and the legacies they leave behind. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep digging deeper into the past. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.